The celestial threshold smelled like ozone, and something floral I couldn't identify, which my briefing packet had failed to mention, would make my sinuses feel like they were hosting a small rebellion. I stood at the entrance to the Hall of Luminous Accord, watching what had to be 300 alien dignitaries glide through the space like they were performing synchronized swimming in air, and seriously reconsidered every life choice that had brought me to this moment. "Engineer Reeves," my translator drone chirped in my ear, bobbing at shoulder height like an overenthusiastic metal fruit. "Your biometric readings indicate significant cardiovascular stress. Shall I summon medical assistance?" "That's just called being terrified, Delta," I whispered back. "It's a human thing. We're allowed to have it at diplomatic functions where one wrong move might start an intergalactic incident." "Fascinating. Shall I log this for the cultural database?" "Please don't." The hall itself defied several laws of physics I'd spent 4 years studying. Crystalline pillars rose from the floor without visible support, humming at a frequency I could feel in my teeth. The ceiling disappeared into something that wasn't quite darkness and wasn't quite light, punctuated by what appeared to be actual stars, though whether they were projections or somehow real I couldn't tell. Banners made of light itself hung in the air, shifting through colors that didn't have names in any human language. The Ascendari had built their star palace in the gravitational sweet spot between three suns, and they wanted everyone to know they had the engineering chops to pull it off. The Ascendari themselves moved through this impossible space with the kind of casual grace that made me hyper-aware of my own tendency to trip over flat surfaces. They looked human enough to trigger uncanny valley responses, which the xenoanthropologists in our delegation found endlessly fascinating, and I found deeply unsettling. The key difference, the thing you noticed immediately, were the ears. Long, elegant, sweeping back from their heads with a slight upward curve at the tips, catching the ambient light like they'd been carved from mother of pearl. Some were adorned with jewelry that seemed to float without touching skin. Others bore intricate tattoos that moved. I watched a nobleman pass within 5 feet of a lady in flowing robes that shifted from deep violet to silver, and they maintained that distance like there was an invisible force field between them. Everyone did. The Ascendari moved in bubbles of personal space, never touching, never even coming close. My briefing had mentioned this in a footnote I'd skimmed at 2 in the morning while trying to figure out if my formal jacket's environmental controls were malfunctioning or just designed by sadists. Speaking of which, the jacket was currently engaged in what felt like active warfare against my circulatory system. It was supposed to regulate my body temperature in the palace's variable atmosphere, but instead it seemed determined to recreate the climate of a mildly hostile sauna. I tugged at the collar, trying to look dignified while basically wrestling with my own clothes. "The ceremony begins in 4 minutes, Delta informed me cheerfully. "You should locate your assigned seating." "Right seating." I pulled up the holographic seating chart on my wrist display, which immediately glitched and showed me what appeared to be a detailed schematic of the palace's waste reclamation system instead. Perfect. Exactly the kind of technical competence that would make humanity look great in front of advanced alien civilizations. "Delta, my display is showing me toilets. That is consistent with my expectations of human technology." "You're supposed to be helpful." "I am being helpful. I'm helping you maintain realistic expectations." I gave up on the display and decided to rely on the ancient human tradition of wandering around looking lost until someone took pity on me. The problem was that the Ascendari didn't seem to do pity. They barely seemed to do acknowledgement. I drifted through the crowd like a ghost at my own funeral, trying to spot anything that looked like a seat designated for minor human functionaries who'd only been invited because someone needed to babysit the delegation's warp drive engineer. The hall was filling rapidly. Nobles in elaborate formal wear that probably cost more than my annual salary took their places on floating platforms that drifted into formation like a very slow, very elegant flock of birds. Some platforms seated single individuals, others held small groups, but always with that careful distance maintained. I watched a family of 4 arrange themselves on their platform with the precision of a military drill, each member exactly the same distance from the others. "This is Ethan Reeves," I muttered to myself, "who once recalibrated a warp core while it was actively engaged but who cannot figure out where to sit at a fancy party. This is fine. Everything is fine." "Your stress levels continue to elevate," Delta observed. "Delta, I swear to every star in this 3-sun system if you don't." The lights dimmed, which I assumed meant the ceremony was starting and I was officially out of time. I spotted what might have been an empty platform near the back, partially obscured by one of those impossible pillars. It would do. It would have to do. I started moving toward it, navigating around clusters of Asindari who parted around me like I was carrying a contagious disease, which, given the touching taboo, I might as well have been. I was 3 steps from my salvation, already planning how I'd very carefully sit down and make myself invisible for the next several hours, when something changed in the air around me. The ambient hum of conversation dropped by several decibels. I felt the weight of attention shift, though I couldn't have explained how I knew. A hand closed around my wrist, not gently, not tentatively, with the kind of certainty that suggested the owner had never questioned a decision in her life and wasn't about to start now. The touch was cool, the grip firm enough that I couldn't have pulled away even if I'd wanted to, which I suddenly very much did because every Asindari in my line of sight had gone absolutely still. I turned, already knowing this was going to be bad, not knowing it was going to be catastrophic. She was tall, nearly my height, with silver-white hair pulled back in an intricate style that displayed her ears in their full glory. They were marked with tiny glyphs that glowed faintly, some kind of royal notation I didn't understand. Her eyes were the color of nebulae I'd seen through observatory scopes, purple and blue and silver all at once, and they were looking directly at me with an intensity that made my earlier stress levels seem quaint. Princess Kael'thar. I knew her face from the briefings, daughter of the Eternal Throne, the one the human diplomats had specifically told us not to approach under any circumstances. Her voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. "Sit here." My legs decided to stop consulting my brain and just folded, dropping me onto the floating platform beside Princess Kael'thar with all the grace of a cargo container, experiencing sudden decompression. The platform didn't even wobble, which seemed unfair given that my entire understanding of the universe was currently wobbling quite dramatically. Her hand released my wrist and returned to her lap, but I could still feel the ghost of those cool fingers wrapped around my skin. The silence in the hall had weight to it now, pressing down on my shoulders like I'd suddenly been transported to a high-gravity world. Hundreds of those elegant long ears were turned in our direction, and behind them, hundreds of nebula-colored eyes were doing complex calculations I desperately wished I could understand. "Delta," I subvocalized, trying not to move my lips. "What exactly just happened?" The translator drone had gone completely silent, which was somehow more terrifying than its usual stream of unhelpful commentary. After what felt like several geological epochs, it finally buzzed to life. "Engineer Reeves, I am required to inform you that according to Asindari cultural protocols, you have just been publicly claimed by a member of the royal family through the ritual of Kethful, which roughly translates to the choosing of proximity, and carries implications of bonding that range from political alliance to romantic intention depending on context. And you should be aware that the penalty for rejecting such a claim can include exile, imprisonment, or in historical cases, molecular disintegration, though that last one hasn't been used in at least 3 generations. You said that without taking a single breath. I do not have lungs. Delta, I'm going to disassemble you and turn you into a very expensive paperweight. That would be inadvisable given your current circumstances. Princess Kael'thar sat beside me with her spine straight enough to make geometry jealous, staring directly ahead at the center of the hall where some kind of holographic display was beginning to coalesce. She didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge me, but I was acutely aware of every molecule of space between us, which was maybe 6 inches and felt like 6 miles and 6 millimeters simultaneously. The ceremony began with a sound like distant stars singing, which I'm aware makes no sense, but that's genuinely what it sounded like. A figure appeared on the central platform, draped in robes that seemed to be made of liquid starlight, and began speaking in the Asundari high tongue. My translator drone provided a running commentary in my ear about trade agreements and cultural exchange, and the great harmony between species. But I couldn't focus on any of it because I was too busy trying not to think about the fact that everyone in the hall kept glancing our way. A nobleman 3 platforms over was staring at me, with the kind of expression usually reserved for finding something unpleasant on the bottom of your shoe. A lady with ears, adorned with floating sapphires, looked like she was mentally composing my eulogy. A younger Asundari, barely out of adolescence judging by the simple style of his ear markings, seemed caught between awe and horror. "Is it possible," I whispered, "that she grabbed the wrong person?" "Unlikely," Delta replied. "The princess's visual acuity is approximately 3 times that of baseline humans. Additionally, your species designation and identification tags are clearly visible on your formal jacket." So she definitely meant to grab me specifically. Yes, the human, the random engineer, me. The evidence supports this conclusion. Delta, I need you to understand that this is the opposite of helpful information. I risked a glance at Princess Kael'thar. In profile, she was all sharp angles and controlled power, the kind of person who'd probably never spilled coffee on herself, or walked into a door frame, or any of the other small humiliations that made up my daily existence. Her jaw was set like she was preparing for battle, which seemed excessive for a diplomatic ceremony, but perhaps made more sense if she just committed some kind of cultural nuclear option by touching me. The speaker continued with what sounded like the Asundari equivalent of thanking everyone for coming and reminding them to silence their communication devices. A human diplomat I vaguely recognized from the shuttle ride stood up when prompted and gave a speech about friendship between worlds that I'm sure was very moving, but sounded like white noise compared to the thundering of my own pulse. "I need to know," I whispered to the air in front of me, not looking at the princess. "What happens next? What am I supposed to do? Delta, give me something useful." "According to cultural protocols, you should maintain the position she has assigned you, respond to any direct communication with appropriate deference, and absolutely under no circumstances attempt to leave before she dismisses you. And if I need to use the bathroom, I would recommend practicing advanced meditation techniques for bladder control. You're enjoying this. I am a translator drone. I do not experience enjoyment. However, if I did, yes." The ceremony rolled on like a glacier made of formality and subtext. There were more speeches, some kind of exchange of crystalline data storage devices that glowed with internal light, and a musical performance that involved instruments I was fairly certain violated the laws of acoustics. Through it all, Princess Kael'thar sat motionless beside me, a statue carved from pale stone and political calculation, except I started to notice things. Small things. The kind of details you only catch when you're sitting close enough to count someone's breaths and have literally nothing else to do because you're terrified to move. Her hands, folded in her lap with aristocratic precision, were trembling. Just slightly. Just enough to make the light catch differently on her fingers every few seconds. Her breathing, when I paid attention to it instead of the ceremony, was too controlled. The kind of control that came from active effort rather than natural calm. She was nervous. Princess Kael'thar, who according to my briefings had negotiated trade agreements with species that communicated through pheromones and color changes, who had once stared down a Vraxian war chief and convinced him to sign a peace treaty, was sitting here beside me actively trying not to shake. That realization did absolutely nothing to calm my own nerves, but it did shift something in my understanding. Whatever was happening, she wasn't doing it from a position of power. She was doing it from a position of something else entirely. A new speaker took the platform, an older Asundari with ears so heavily decorated they seemed to be more jewelry than flesh. He began speaking about the importance of tradition, of maintaining the old ways even as they embraced new alliances. Delta translated, but I barely needed it. The way the speaker's eyes kept drifting to our platform, the subtle emphasis on certain words made his meaning clear. This speech was aimed at us, at her, at whatever she'd just done by grabbing my wrist and pulling me down beside her. I watched her jaw tighten incrementally, watched the trembling in her hands still into absolute rigidity. She was holding herself together through what had to be sheer force of will, and I suddenly understood with uncomfortable clarity that I wasn't the only person on this platform who had no idea what they were doing and was terrified of the consequences. The speaker concluded with what sounded like a very pointed blessing for those who honored tradition, and sat down to scattered applause that felt more obligatory than enthusiastic. The ceremony moved on to what Delta informed me was the presentation of cultural gifts, which apparently involved a lot of floating boxes and solemn nodding. I had just convinced myself that maybe I could survive this, that maybe I could sit here for however many more hours this lasted, and then figure out what to do about my sudden involuntary entanglement with alien royalty, when Princess Kael'thar spoke. Her voice was low, pitched to carry only to me, barely more than a breath in the space between us. "Thank you for not running." 4 words. 4 words that contained depths of meaning I couldn't begin to navigate. They suggested she'd expected me to run. They suggested she'd worried I might. They suggested that my staying, my simple act of sitting here because my legs had given out and I was too confused to do anything else, meant something. I turned my head just enough to look at her. She was still staring straight ahead, still maintaining that perfect aristocratic posture, but at the very corner of her mouth, I caught something that might have been the ghost of relief. "I'm not actually sure I could run in this jacket," I whispered back. "The environmental controls have decided to wage war on my circulatory system." The corner of her mouth twitched. It was barely perceptible, probably invisible to anyone more than a foot away. But I was close enough to see it, and it hit me with the force of a successful warp jump. Princess Kael'thar, terror of the Asundari court, had almost smiled at my complaint about my malfunctioning jacket. "Human environmental requirements are inefficient," she murmured, still facing forward. "Your species operates within absurdly narrow temperature parameters," says the civilization that built a palace requiring 3 suns to maintain proper lighting. Another twitch, stronger this time. I was developing a dangerous addiction to making it happen. The ceremony continued its glacial progression through what Delta informed me was the traditional recounting of historical alliances, which apparently stretched back several thousand years and involved a lot of species I'd never heard of. An Asundari with golden threads woven through her hair stood and began speaking in a melodic cadence about the Treaty of the Seventh Moon, and I watched approximately 40% of the audience's attention drift toward our platform instead. A man with military bearing and ears marked with what looked like tactical notation was openly glaring at me. Not at the princess. At me specifically, like I'd personally insulted his entire genetic line. Beside him, a younger woman kept whispering to her companion behind a hand that didn't quite conceal her mouth, and I didn't need translation to know they were discussing us. "So," I whispered, trying to sound casual while my stress hormones were having a full-scale rave. "On a scale of minor cultural misstep to intergalactic incident, where would you—" "It was not intended to be." The speaker concluded her historical recitation and yielded the platform to someone who looked like they'd been born wearing formal robes. He launched into what Delta translated as an explanation of trade route expansions, complete with holographic star maps that bloomed in the air like luminous flowers. I tried to focus on the pretty lights, and not on the fact that a woman 2 platforms over was staring at Kael'thar with such naked hatred that I reflexively checked for concealed weapons. "Question," I said quietly. "How many people in this room currently want to kill me?" "Approximately 30% want to kill you. Another 40% want to use you for political advantage. The remaining 30% are trying to determine which category they fall into." "And you, which category are you in?" She was quiet for long enough that I thought she wouldn't answer. On the central platform, the speaker was gesturing at a particularly complex trade route that apparently connected 7 different systems through a series of carefully calibrated gravity wells. It looked like someone had tried to map spaghetti in 4 dimensions. "I am in the category of people who made a desperate decision and are now discovering the full implications of their desperation," Kael'thar said finally. "That's weirdly honest. You are sitting in the one position where I cannot easily lie to you. Our proximity makes certain forms of deception extremely difficult." I processed that. "Is that why nobody touches?" "Because it makes lying harder. Among other reasons, physical contact creates obligation. It implies trust. It suggests that the boundaries between self and other have been negotiated and found acceptable." She paused. "Touching someone uninvited is considered assault. Touching someone publicly is a declaration. And you just declared something about me, to everyone here." "Yes. What exactly?" "That is still being determined." The trade route presentation concluded with what I assumed was the Ascendari equivalent of polite applause, which sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Another speaker rose, this one elderly with ears so long they nearly brushed his shoulders, and began discussing agricultural cooperation in low-gravity environments. It should have been boring enough to let my mind drift, but I was too busy running probability calculations on my own survival. Delta chirped softly in my ear. "Engineer Reeves, I am receiving urgent communications from the human delegation. Ambassador Williams would like to know what you are doing, and why you are doing it, and whether you require immediate extraction. Tell the ambassador that I am sitting very still and trying not to cause an intergalactic incident, which I feel I'm doing admirably under the circumstances." The ambassador responds that sitting next to Princess Kael'thar is, itself, an intergalactic incident. Then tell him it's too late for extraction, and he should probably start working on his apology speeches. Kael'thar's shoulders shifted infinitesimally. "Your diplomatic corps is in distress." "My diplomatic corps is always in distress. It's their natural state. If they're not panicking about something, they assume they've missed a crisis. A wise policy, given present circumstances." The agricultural speaker was replaced by someone discussing energy grid innovations, which actually caught my professional interest despite everything. They were describing a system that harvested quantum fluctuations from dimensional membranes, which should have been theoretically impossible, but apparently the Ascendari had decided theory was more of a suggestion than a rule. I leaned forward slightly to get a better view of the holographic schematics. Kael'thar leaned forward with me, maintaining our distance with mathematical precision. I froze. She froze. We both realized simultaneously that we just synchronized our movements, which probably meant something in Ascendari body language that I absolutely did not want to know about. I could feel the weight of observation increase, if that was even possible. The military-looking man had progressed from glaring to looking like he was calculating firing solutions. "I think I just made it worse," I whispered. "Yes," Kael'thar agreed. "But the energy grid design is fascinating, so perhaps it was worth it." I turned my head just enough to look at her properly. She was still staring forward, still maintaining that perfect posture, but there was something in her voice that hadn't been there before. Something that sounded almost like humor, buried deep beneath layers of royal training and political necessity. "You're a little bit insane, aren't you?" I said. "I am the daughter of the eternal throne. Sanity is optional." "Is that in the job description?" "It is in the subtext of the job description, which is considerably more important." The energy presentation concluded and gave way to what Delta informed me was a ceremonial exchange of technological gifts, which involved a lot of bowing and presentation of crystalline devices that probably did incredible things and looked like very expensive paperweights. I watched the human ambassador present something that was supposed to represent our latest advances in medical nanotechnology, and tried not to think about how primitive it probably looked compared to whatever the Asundari were working on. A young Asundari woman approached our platform, moving with the careful precision of someone navigating a minefield. She kept her eyes down, her hands visible and empty, and stopped at a distance that I was starting to recognize as the minimum acceptable boundary. When she spoke, her voice barely carried. "Your Highness, Lord Vekith requests an audience at the conclusion of the ceremony." "Lord Vekith can request whatever he wishes," Kael'thar replied. "I am otherwise occupied." The messenger's ears flattened slightly, a gesture I didn't need translation to understand as distress. "He was quite insistent, Highness." "Then he can be insistently disappointed." The messenger retreated like she'd been released from a gravitational field, and I caught a glimpse of the man who must be Lord Vekith watching from across the hall. The military one. The one who looked at me like I was a problem that required a tactical solution. "Let me guess," I said. "Lord Vekith is in the 30% who want me dead." "Lord Vekith wants many things. Your death is merely one item on a very long list." "Should I be flattered that I made the list?" "You should be concerned that you're currently preventing him from achieving several other items higher on that list." Another speaker took the platform, beginning what sounded like closing remarks about unity and cooperation, and the bright future of interspecies collaboration. The ambient light in the hall began to shift, taking on warmer tones that suggested we were finally approaching the end of this marathon of formality. Kael'thar's hands, which had been rigidly still in her lap, slowly relaxed. The trembling from earlier was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. She took a breath that was deeper than the controlled ones she'd been taking for the past 2 hours. "When this concludes," she said quietly, "there will be a receiving period. People will want to speak with me, with us. Do I need to say anything? You need to stand beside me and look like you belong there. I'm an engineer. I specialize in machines, not acting. Then treat it like a machine. Input, formal social situation. Output, appropriate social response. You have algorithms for this." "My algorithms are primarily designed for not getting sucked into reactor cores. The principle is similar. Avoid getting destroyed by things more powerful than yourself." I laughed before I could stop myself, a short bark of sound that cut through the ceremonial atmosphere like a warp breach. Several heads turned. Kael'thar's lips pressed together, but I could see her fighting something that might have been laughter of her own. The final speaker concluded with a blessing in the old tongue, and the lights in the hall bloomed into their full brilliance. The ceremony was over. The platforms began to drift back toward the main floor, and I realized with a cold clarity that the easy part was finished. Now came whatever happened next. The platform touched down with the kind of gentle precision that suggested gravity itself was being polite. Kael'thar rose in one fluid motion, and I scrambled to follow with significantly less grace, my knees protesting the 2 hours of sitting in what my body had interpreted as a stress position. Around us, the crowd began to flow toward the reception halls like a slow tide of elegant robes and careful personal boundaries. "Stay close," Kael'thar said, not looking at me. "Within arm's reach. It matters." Because of the proximity thing. Because if you drift too far, it suggests doubt. Doubt invites challenge. And challenge means what exactly? Strongly worded letters, formal debates. Duels usually, sometimes assassination. The Asindari prefer our political violence to have proper structure. I decided she was joking, probably, maybe. The look on her face suggested she might not be, which was deeply concerning. We moved into the crowd, and it parted around us like we were emitting some kind of force field. The careful distance everyone maintained from each other extended to us, but with an extra buffer zone that felt almost aggressive in its emphasis. Delta buzzed quietly. Ambassador Williams is approaching. He appears to be experiencing significant emotional distress. How can you tell? His cardiac rhythm is visible from orbit. The ambassador materialized from the crowd looking like a man who'd aged a decade in the past 2 hours. His formal jacket was slightly askew, and his hair had escaped whatever product had been holding it in place. He stopped at the appropriate distance from Kael'thar, gave a bow that was probably textbook perfect, and then looked at me with the expression of a parent discovering their child had decided to juggle chainsaws. "Engineer Reeves," he said with admirable calm, "might I inquire as to your current status? I'm discovering that sitting down is more complicated than I previously believed." "Your Highness," the ambassador continued, smoothly redirecting to Kael'thar, "the human delegation is honored by your attention to our colleague, though we confess some confusion as to the protocols involved." "There is no confusion," Kael'thar replied. "Engineer Reeves has accepted a position in my household. The protocols are clear." I made a sound that was probably not diplomatic. "I'm sorry, I've accepted what now?" "We will discuss the details privately," she said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite a command but wasn't quite a request either. "Ambassador Williams, your delegation performed admirably during the ceremony. The Eternal Throne will be pleased." It was a dismissal wrapped in a compliment, and the ambassador recognized it immediately. He gave another bow, shot me a look that conveyed approximately 17 different warnings and one plea for mercy, and retreated into the crowd. I watched him go with the sinking feeling of a man watching his last lifeboat drift away. "I don't remember accepting a position," I said. "You sat where I told you to sit. You remained when you could have fled. In our culture, that is acceptance. In my culture, that's called being too confused to move." The outcome is identical. We were moving through the reception hall now, past tables laden with food that glowed in colors food should not glow, past conversation clusters that fell silent as we passed. Lord Veketh stood near one of the crystalline pillars, surrounded by what looked like military advisors or possibly hired muscle. His ears were decorated with sharp silver pieces that looked less like jewelry and more like weaponry. He didn't approach, but his eyes tracked us with the intensity of targeting systems. Kael'thar didn't acknowledge him, didn't change her pace, but I felt her tension increase like someone had turned up the gravity. "That's the one who wanted to talk to you," I said. "That is the one who wanted me to marry his son and consolidate two of the most powerful military houses in the empire. And I'm currently interfering with that plan." "You are currently obliterating that plan. My choice of you makes a statement about my priorities that is both public and irrevocable." "What statement exactly?" She was quiet for several steps, navigating us around a group of younger Asindari who bowed so low their ears nearly touched the floor. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible over the ambient music that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "That I choose connection over strategy. That I value individual agency over political convenience. That I am willing to break every expectation placed upon me since birth to claim something that is mine alone to claim." "You chose me for that, a random human engineer you'd never met. I chose you because you were outside the system, because claiming you meant claiming my own autonomy. Because in that moment, watching you search for somewhere to belong, I saw someone as trapped by circumstance as I was." She paused. "And because your file indicated you once told a superior officer that his understanding of warp mechanics was theoretically possible but practically idiotic. which suggested a useful disregard for authority. I laughed, sharp and surprised. That got me demoted. That made you interesting. We reached what appeared to be a private alcove, separated from the main hall by curtains of light that rippled like water. Kael'thar stepped through and I followed, and suddenly the noise of the reception dropped to a distant murmur. The space was small, intimate, with a view of the three suns through a window that definitely hadn't been there a moment ago. She turned to face me fully for the first time since grabbing my wrist, and I saw the exhaustion in her eyes beneath the royal bearing. I have placed you in considerable danger. Lord Veketh is not accustomed to being denied, and there are others who see you as either a threat or an opportunity. Your life has become significantly more complicated. I noticed. You could refuse formally. It would cause scandal, but you would be free to return to your delegation and eventually to Earth. The dishonor would fall primarily on me. I thought about it, really thought about it. Thought about going back to my quiet life, calibrating warp drives and avoiding diplomatic functions. Thought about never having to worry about assassination or political intrigue, or sitting through ceremonies that lasted longer than some planetary orbits. It sounded peaceful, safe, boring. What happens if I stay? I asked. You become part of my household, you attend court functions, you learn our ways, you survive assassination attempts with what I'm told is characteristic human resilience. Her expression shifted slightly. You help me navigate the impossible position of being born to rule while wanting to choose my own path. That sounds terrible. It does. Dangerous, complicated, probably going to get me killed. Almost certainly. When do I start? Something happened to her face. The rigid control cracked, just for a moment, and what showed through was relief and surprise and something that might have been hope. Her ears tilted forward, a gesture Delta had once told me indicated openness and trust. You're staying, she said, like she needed to confirm it. I once recalibrated a warp core during active engagement. How much harder can royal politics be? Significantly harder. Warp cores don't hold grudges. Good point, but I've always wanted to learn a new skill set. She studied me for a long moment, and I studied her back. In the light of the three suns, her ears caught the illumination and seemed to glow from within, and I realized that whatever I'd stumbled into, it was going to change everything about the person I'd been. The careful engineer who followed protocols and avoided complications was going to have to become someone else. Someone who could stand beside an alien princess and pretend he belonged there until the pretending became real. There is a story my people tell, Kael'thar said quietly, gesturing to the window and the three suns beyond. About those stars. They were once separate, burning alone, until gravity and time brought them together into something stronger than any of them could be alone. The bond created something new, a stable point in space where life could flourish. That's a metaphor, isn't it? That is a warning. Bonding changes both parties. You will not remain the person you were. Good, I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. That person spent 2 hours sitting beside you without saying anything interesting. The new version should probably aim higher. Her lips curved into something that was definitely